The midday sun beat down on the asphalt roof of Big T's Diner in Lockhart, Texas, turning the interior into a humid box of frying grease and stale coffee. Clara wiped the counter with a rag that had seen better days, her forehead glistening with sweat, her feet throbbing from a double shift. It was a Tuesday, usually a slow day, but the lunch rush had been brutal, filled with truckers and locals complaining about the heat. The bell above the door chimed, not with the polite tinkle of a customer, but with the heavy, ominous thud of a heavy boot kicking the doorframe. The room went quiet, the chatter of the regulars dying down instantly as a shadow fell across the threshold. It was a biker, a massive man wearing a leather cut that looked like it had been dragged through gravel and war. The patch on the back read, Iron Drifters, a club known throughout the county for hard riding and harder fighting. His name was Silas Kincaid, known on the street as Rook, and his face was a map of his history. A jagged scar ran from his ear to his jaw, disappearing into a thick, unkempt beard. He walked to the counter, the sound of his spurs clicking against the linoleum floor, a rhythmic warning that set everyone on edge. He didn't look at the patrons who were staring at him with open hostility. His dark eyes were fixed on the menu board above Clara's head. Rook wasn't there for trouble. He was just passing through on a run to Austin and needed caffeine to keep the road hypnosis at bay. He sat on a stool that groaned under his weight, placing a dusty helmet on the pristine counter. Clara felt a knot of fear tighten in her stomach, fed by the stories the sheriff told about the bikers. Drugs, violence, chaos. She approached him hesitantly, clutching her notepad like a shield, keeping her distance as if he were a wild animal that might bite. Rook looked down at her, sensing the tension, and tried to soften his expression, though the scar made his smile look more like a grimace. Just a black coffee, darling, and maybe a slice of that pecan pie if it's fresh, he said, his voice a deep rumble that vibrated through the counter. He reached into his vest pocket to pull out a crumpled $5 bill, his movement sudden enough to make Clara flinch and take a step back. Rook paused, his hand freezing in midair. Realizing she thought he was reaching for a weapon, he slowly placed the money on the counter, sliding it forward with 2 fingers, trying to show he meant no harm. "I ain't gonna hurt you," he muttered, looking down at his hands, which were stained with grease from working on his bike. A few locals in the booth behind him snickered, emboldened by the safety of numbers. "Careful, Clara," Old Man Miller shouted from the back. "Don't let him steal the silverware." The diner erupted in nervous laughter, a wave of mockery directed at the solitary figure at the counter. Rook stiffened, his jaw clenching, but he didn't turn around. He was used to the judgment, used to being the villain in everyone else's story. Clara, however, was stressed, tired, and suddenly angry, not at the locals, but at the tension this man brought into her sanctuary. She poured the coffee, her hand shaking, splashing a little on the saucer. When Rook reached for the cup, his fingers brushed hers, and she recoiled as if burned. The cup rattled against the saucer, the sound sharp in the quiet room. "I don't want your money," Clara snapped, the words tumbling out louder than she intended, fueled by adrenaline and exhaustion. She pushed the $5 bill back toward him. "We don't serve your kind here. Just take the coffee and go." It was a harsh public rejection, a line drawn in the sand that humiliated him in front of the entire town. Rook stared at her, the hurt flashing in his eyes for a microsecond before the stone mask slammed back into place. He looked at the coffee, then at the money, and finally at Clara, seeing the genuine fear and disdain in her eyes. He slowly stood up, towering over the counter, his presence suddenly suffocating the room. The laughter stopped dead. "My kind?" Rook asked quietly, his voice devoid of anger but heavy with disappointment. "You think the patch makes the man?" He didn't wait for an answer. He picked up his helmet, leaving the money and the untouched coffee on the counter. He turned and walked to the door, his boots heavy on the floor, passing the locals who now looked at their plates, unable to meet his gaze. The door swung shut behind him, the bell jingling cheerfully, a stark contrast to the heavy silence he left behind. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding, her hands trembling as she grabbed the rag to wipe the spot where his helmet had rested. She felt a strange mixture of relief and guilt, a nagging feeling that she had just kicked a dog that wasn't biting. "Good for you, Clara," Miller cheered, raising his iced tea. "Show 'em we don't need their trash in Lockhart." The diner slowly returned to life, the conversations resuming, the tension fading. Clara forced a smile, nodding at the customers, but the victory felt hollow, like ash in her mouth. Outside, the roar of a V-twin engine shattered the afternoon peace, a loud defiant thunder that shook the windows of the diner. Rook revved the engine hard, once, twice, a primal scream of frustration before peeling out of the parking lot. The sound faded into the distance, heading toward the highway, and Clara told herself she was glad he was gone. She checked the clock on the wall. Her shift was over in 10 minutes. She just wanted to get to her car, drive home, and forget the look in the biker's eyes. She didn't know that the day wasn't over, and that the man she had just cast out was the only thing standing between her and a nightmare. The sun began to dip lower, casting long shadows across the parking lot, hiding the rusted grey van that had been idling near the dumpster for the last hour. The driver watched the biker leave, then turned his gaze to the back door of the diner, waiting. Rook rode hard, the wind whipping against his face, stinging his eyes, but he welcomed the pain because it distracted him from the humiliation. He pushed his Harley-Davidson diner to 80 miles per hour on the county road, the vibration of the handlebars numbing his hands. He had stopped at that diner hoping for 5 minutes of human connection, a break from the solitude of the road, and instead he had been treated like a leper. It was the burden of the outlaw life. People loved the romance of the biker on TV, but they hated the reality of the grit in their town. He pulled over about 2 miles down the road, guiding the bike onto a gravel shoulder near an old oak tree. He needed nicotine to settle his nerves. He killed the engine, the sudden silence of the Texas plains rushing in to fill the void, broken only by the ticking of the cooling metal. Rook dismounted, his bad knee popping, and fished a pack of Marlboros from his vest. He lit one, inhaling deeply, watching the smoke drift back toward the town that had just rejected him. Back at the diner, Clara was untying her apron, her hands still shaking slightly. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, replaced by a deep, exhaustion-induced anxiety. She clocked out, grabbed her purse, and waved goodbye to the cook, pushing through the back door into the employee parking lot. The heat was still oppressive, the asphalt radiating waves of shimmering distortion. Her car, a beat-up Toyota sedan, was parked in the far corner near the dumpsters where the shadows were deepest. She fumbled for her keys, her mind replaying the scene with the biker. She remembered the scar on his face and the way his eyes had looked, sad, not angry. Guilt pricked at her again. She had let the town's prejudices dictate her actions, and it didn't sit right with how her mother raised her. As she reached her car door, a metallic sliding sound made her freeze. The rusted grey van she hadn't noticed earlier suddenly lurched forward, blocking her exit path. The side door flew open and 2 men jumped out. They weren't bikers, they were drifters, meth heads with gaunt faces and desperate eyes, wearing dirty flannel and smelling of chemicals. Clara dropped her keys, the sound of metal hitting asphalt echoing loudly in the empty lot. "Hey!" she shouted, trying to sound authoritative, but her voice cracked. "You need to move that van!" The men didn't speak. One of them, a tall man with rotting teeth, lunged at her, grinning. Clara screamed, a high-pitched sound of pure terror, and tried to run back toward the diner's rear entrance. But the second man was faster. He grabbed her by her ponytail, yanking her back with brutal force. She fell hard onto the pavement, scraping her palms and knees, the breath knocked out of her lungs. "Shut up, bitch," the tall man hissed, grabbing her arm and dragging her toward the open maw of the van. Clara kicked and scratched, her nails raking across his face, drawing blood, but he was fueled by drugs and didn't seem to feel it. He struck her across the face, a heavy backhand that made her vision swim with stars. Inside the diner, the jukebox was playing a loud country song, drowning out the scuffle in the back lot. The cook was scraping the grill, the noise of metal on metal masking the muffled cries outside. No one was coming. Clara realized with a chilling clarity that she was going to disappear, just another statistic on the nightly news. Meanwhile, 2 miles away, Rook was finishing his cigarette, staring at the ground. He had a strange feeling in his gut, an instinct honed by years of living in dangerous situations. It was a tightness in his chest, a sense that the balance of the world was off. He looked back toward the diner. He told himself to forget it, to ride on to Austin, and leave these people to their fate. But Rook lived by a code. The Iron Drifters weren't Boy Scouts, but they were protectors of their own kind, and they despised predators who preyed on the weak. He remembered the van he had seen parked by the dumpsters when he arrived. It had looked out of place, idling with no one getting out. And he remembered Clara, the fear in her eyes, even before he walked in. He dropped the cigarette and crushed it under his boot. He couldn't shake the feeling. Damn it, he grunted to himself. If he went back and nothing was wrong, he looked like a fool or a stalker. If he didn't go back and something was wrong, he couldn't live with himself. He swung his leg over the diner, kick-starting the engine. He didn't turn toward Austin. He whipped the bike around in a spray of gravel, the rear tire biting into the asphalt as he gunned the throttle. He headed back toward the diner, pushing the bike to its limit. Back in the lot, the men had Clara halfway into the van. She grabbed the doorframe, her fingers white-knuckled, holding on for dear life. "Help!" she screamed again, her voice raw and tearing at her throat. "Somebody help me!" The tall man slammed a fist into her ribs, trying to break her grip. Rook was a mile away when he saw the glint of the sun off a windshield in the back lot, confirming activity where there should be stillness. He narrowed his eyes, leaning forward over the tank, becoming aerodynamic. The pressure was building, a countdown clock ticking in his head. He wasn't thinking about the rejection anymore. He wasn't thinking about the insult. He was thinking about the predator and the prey. He shifted gears, the engine screaming, closing the distance with the speed of a guided missile. He was coming back to the place that hated him, to save the woman who had cast him out. The grey van's engine roared to life, the driver gunning it even before the sliding door was fully closed. Clara was inside now, thrown onto the dirty metal floor among fast food wrappers and tools. The tall man was on top of her, pinning her wrists, his breath reeking of decay. The van lurched forward, tires squealing as it sped toward the exit of the parking lot that led to the main highway. If they hit the open road, she was gone. Rook crested the small hill leading to the diner just as the van peeled out of the lot, cutting across the gravel shoulder to merge onto the road. He saw it, the frantic movement inside, the passenger door not fully shut. He didn't need a written invitation to know what was happening. The rage that filled him was cold and precise, a tool he knew how to use. He didn't slow down. He twisted the throttle of the Harley until the cable was taut, the speedometer climbing past 90. The van was heavy and slow to accelerate. Rook was a bullet. He closed the gap in seconds, the roar of his pipes announcing his arrival like a thunderclap from hell. The driver of the van looked in his side mirror and saw the black shape approaching, eyes widening in panic. "Biker!" the driver shouted to the men in the back. "That freak is back!" The tall man looked up from Clara, distracted. Clara used the moment to knee him in the groin with everything she had left. He howled in pain, loosening his grip. She scrambled toward the back doors, but they were locked. Rook pulled up alongside the driver's side of the van, crossing the double yellow line into oncoming traffic. A pickup truck coming the other way honked and swerved, but Rook held his line, inches from the van's metal skin. He looked through the driver's window, his face a mask of fury, and kicked the side of the van with his heavy boot, a resounding thud that shook the vehicle. The driver swerved, trying to knock Rook off the road, but Rook anticipated the move and braked hard, letting the van swing wide, then accelerated again to the passenger side. He needed to stop them before they reached the interstate. He reached into his vest and pulled out a heavy steel chain with a padlock on the end, a classic biker tool for adjustments. He swung the chain, shattering the passenger side window in a shower of safety glass. The man in the passenger seat screamed, covering his face. The driver panicked, jerking the wheel. The van fishtailed, losing momentum on the dusty asphalt. Rook was herding them like cattle, forcing them off the road. Inside the van, the chaos gave Clara a fighting chance. The van swerved violently, throwing the men off balance. She crawled toward the front, screaming, trying to grab the steering wheel, trying to crash the van. Anything was better than where they were taking her. The tall man grabbed her ankle, dragging her back. Rook saw the struggle through the windshield. He knew he had to end this now. He pulled ahead of the van, a dangerous maneuver, and began to slow down, forcing the driver to either hit him or stop. It was a game of chicken, steel against flesh, and Rook bet his life that the driver didn't have the nerve to commit murder on a public highway. The driver slammed on the brakes, the tires smoking and locking up. The van skidded sideways, missing Rook's rear fender by inches, and slid into the ditch on the side of the road, coming to a halt in a cloud of dust and dry grass. Rook spun his bike around, killed the engine, and kicked the stand down in one fluid motion. He didn't run. He stalked. He walked toward the van with the heavy chain wrapped around his fist, his spurs clicking on the asphalt. The silence of the Texas plain returned, heavy and ominous. The side door of the van flew open, and the three men tumbled out, coughing in the dust, brandishing knives and a tire iron. They saw one man, just one biker with a bad leg and a chain. They thought they had the advantage. They didn't know that Rook had been an enforcer for the Iron Drifters for 10 years. They didn't know he had fought in prison yards and alleyways where mercy didn't exist. "Let her go," Rook said, his voice low, vibrating with suppressed violence. He stood 10 feet away, a solitary figure against the setting sun. "Walk away now and you might keep your teeth." The tall man, recovering from the groin strike, spat blood on the ground and raised his knife. "Get him, boys. He's just one cripple." The 3 attackers fanned out, surrounding Rook. Clara, peeking from the open door of the van, watched in horror. She realized with a jolt that he had come back. After everything she said, he had come back. Rook didn't flinch as they circled. He watched their eyes, waiting for the twitch that signaled the attack. The escalation was complete. There was no more road, no more chase. Now, there was only the violence. The first attacker, a wiry man with a tire iron, lunged at Rook from the left, swinging for the head. Rook didn't back up. He stepped into the swing, taking the blow on his raised forearm. A sickening crack echoed, but Rook's leather jacket absorbed the worst of it. Before the man could retract, Rook drove a fist into his solar plexus, doubling him over, and followed with a knee to the face. The man dropped like a sack of cement, the tire iron clattering across the road. The tall man with the knife screamed and charged, aiming for Rook's stomach. Rook sidestepped, his bad knee buckling slightly under the sudden shift in weight, but he kept his balance. He swung the heavy chain, the padlock catching the knife wielder on the wrist, shattering bone. The knife fell, but the man was high on adrenaline and meth. He didn't stop. He tackled Rook and they both went down into the dirt of the ditch. It turned into a brawl, dirty and desperate. Rook took a punch to his already scarred jaw, tasting copper. He grunted, using his weight to roll the attacker over, pinning him. He delivered 2 brutal punches to the man's face, ensuring he wouldn't get up anytime soon. But the third man, the driver, had circled around and kicked Rook hard in the ribs. Rook wheezed, the air leaving his lungs, pain flaring hot and sharp in his side. He rolled away, struggling to stand. The driver picked up a large rock from the ditch and raised it high, intending to crush Rook's skull while he was down. Clara, watching from the van, couldn't stay paralyzed any longer. She saw the angel of her salvation bleeding in the dirt. She scrambled out of the van, grabbed the discarded tire iron and ran toward the fight. She wasn't a fighter, but desperation gave her strength. She swung the iron, hitting the driver in the back of the knees. It wasn't a knockout blow, but it was enough to make him stumble and drop the rock, which landed harmlessly in the grass. The driver whirled around, backhanding Clara and sending her sprawling into the dust. "Stupid bitch!" he yelled, raising his hand to strike her again. But that moment of distraction was all Rook needed. He roared, a sound of pure protective fury, and launched himself from the ground. He tackled the driver, slamming him into the side of the van. This time, Rook didn't hold back. He unleashed a flurry of punches, heavy piston-like blows, that broke the man's nose and orbital bone. He didn't stop until the man went limp, sliding down the side of the van to leave a smear of blood on the grey metal. Rook stepped back, his chest heaving, his knuckles split and bleeding. He looked around. 3 men down. The threats were neutralized. He spat a mouthful of blood onto the ground and turned to look for Clara. She was sitting in the dust, holding her cheek, staring at him with wide, terrified eyes. He limped over to her, his breathing ragged. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain in his ribs and knee was screaming for attention. He looked terrifying. Covered in dust and blood, his beard matted, his eyes wild. Clara flinched as he approached, instinct taking over. Rook saw the flinch. He stopped 5 feet away, raising his hands slowly to show they were empty. "You okay?" he rasped, his voice rougher than usual. "Did they cut you?" He didn't move closer, respecting her space, remembering how she had recoiled from him in the diner. Clara shook her head, tears cutting tracks through the dust on her face. I think I'm okay," she stammered. She looked at the men groaning on the ground, then back at Rook. "You came back," she whispered, as if she couldn't believe it. "Why did you come back?" Rook reached into his pocket for a handkerchief to wipe the blood from his eye, but found it ruined. He used his sleeve instead. "Because you needed help," he said simply. "Doesn't matter what you said, matters what they were doing." The sound of sirens began to wail in the distance, getting louder. Someone had finally called the cops, or a passing car had seen the wreckage. Rook looked toward the highway. He knew how this looked. a biker standing over 3 beaten men and a crying woman. The police in this town weren't exactly friends of the iron drifters. "Cops are coming," Rook said. He looked at his bike, then at Clara. "You safe now? I should go before they start asking questions I don't want to answer." He took a step toward his diner, wincing as his bad leg took his weight. "No!" Clara scrambled up, ignoring the pain in her ankle. She ran to him and grabbed his arm, the leather sleeve she had been afraid to touch an hour ago. "Don't go, please. You're hurt." She looked at his bleeding knuckles and the way he was holding his side. Rook looked down at her hand on his arm. It was a small touch, but it felt heavier than the chain he carried. He paused, torn between the instinct to flee and the need to ensure she was truly safe. The sirens were close now, blue and red lights flashing against the twilight sky. The break in the violence had come, but the consequences were just arriving. The sheriff's cruiser skidded to a halt, gravel spraying everywhere, followed by an ambulance. Sheriff Brody, a man with a belly that strained his uniform and a mustache that had seen 3 decades of Texas law enforcement, stepped out with his gun drawn. "Hands in the air! Everyone!" he bellowed, pointing the weapon at Rook. Rook didn't raise his hands immediately. He just slowly moved them away from his body, palms open. "Easy, Brody," Rook said calmly. "Situation is contained." He knew Brody. They had a mutual, begrudging respect born of years of run-ins. But a biker standing over 3 bodies was always a trigger-happy moment for a cop. Clara stepped in front of Rook, shielding him with her own body. "Don't shoot him," she screamed at the sheriff. "He saved me. They were kidnapping me." Her defense of him was fierce, shocking Brody, who lowered his gun slightly, looking confused. This was the waitress from Big T's defending an iron drifter. The paramedics rushed past the sheriff to check on the men on the ground and then moved toward Clara. Rook leaned back against his bike, his energy draining fast. He pulled a fresh cigarette from his pocket with shaking hands, trying to light it, but his lighter wouldn't spark. He felt dizzy. The blow to the ribs might have cracked something. Clara waved the paramedics away from herself. "Check him," she ordered, pointing at Rook. "He's bleeding." She walked over to Rook, taking the lighter from his hand. She flicked it once, the flame jumping up, and lit his cigarette for him. Rook took a drag, nodding a silent thanks, his eyes studying her face. "You got a hell of a swing with that tire iron," Rook muttered, exhaling smoke. It was the first time he had cracked a joke, a small bridge over the chasm of their earlier interaction. Clara let out a watery laugh that turned into a sob. The adrenaline crash was hitting her hard. She started to shiver violently, the shock setting in. Rook saw the tremors. Without hesitation, he unzipped his heavy leather vest, his cut, and took it off. Underneath, he wore a black t-shirt soaked with sweat and dust. He draped the heavy leather jacket over Clara's shoulders. It was huge on her, smelling of tobacco, oil, and the road. It weighed a ton, but it felt like armor. "Keep it on," Rook said gently. "Helps with the shock." Clara pulled the lapels tight, burying her nose in the collar. She looked at the patches on the vest, the skull, the wings, the words "Iron Drifters." An hour ago, these symbols had meant danger to her. Now, they meant safety. "I'm so sorry," Clara whispered, looking up at him. "At the diner. What I said. I judged you. I was so stupid." The shame was etched on her face. She had treated her savior like garbage, and he had paid her back with blood and protection. Rook looked at the horizon, where the sun had finally set. "World teaches you to fear the wolf," he said softly. "But sometimes you need a wolf to fight the coyotes." He looked back at her. "Next time, darling, don't judge the patch. Judge the man wearing it." Sheriff Brody walked over, holstering his gun. He looked at the unconscious kidnappers being loaded into the ambulance, then at Rook. "Hell of a mess, Kincaid," Brody grunted. "You realize I gotta take a statement. You can't just beat 3 men half to death and ride off." "Self-defense, Sheriff," Clara interjected sharply. "Defense of a third party. I'll testify. I'll tell everyone." She stood taller in Rook's vest. "He's a hero." Rook winced at the word. "I ain't a hero, Clara. I just hate bullies." He tossed his cigarette butt onto the road. "I'll give my statement, Brody, but I ain't going to the station in cuffs. I ride in on my own." The paramedics tried to get Rook to sit on a gurney, but he refused. He sat on the asphalt, leaning against his front wheel. Clara sat next to him, not caring about the dirt on her uniform. For the first time, the town's divide between citizen and outlaw vanished. They were just 2 survivors sitting on the side of the road. The rock bottom wasn't the fight. It was the realization of how wrong she had been. Clara looked at the man beside her, broken knuckles, bruised face, tired eyes, and realized that the monsters she feared were the clean-shaven men in the van, and the angel she needed was the dirty biker she had scorned. News traveled faster than a brush fire in Lockhart. By the time the sheriff finished taking statements on the roadside, a small crowd had gathered near the police tape, locals who had driven out to see the commotion. Among them were the same patrons from the diner, including Old Man Miller. They watched in stunned silence as Clara, the town's sweetheart waitress, stood wrapped in an iron drifter's vest, tending to the wounds of Silas Kincaid. Sheriff Brody walked over to the crowd to disperse them, but not before dropping a truth bomb. "Those boys in the van, wanted in 3 states for trafficking," Brody said loud enough for everyone to hear. "If Kincaid hadn't stopped them, Clara would be halfway to Mexico by now. You folks might want to remember that next time you run your mouths." The revelation hit the crowd hard. Miller looked down at his boots, his face red with shame. They had laughed at Rook, mocked him, and cheered his departure. And while they sat eating pie, he was out there fighting a war to save one of their own. The narrative of the evil biker crumbled instantly, replaced by an uncomfortable gratitude. Clara handed the vest back to Rook as he prepared to leave. "You sure you don't want to go to the hospital?" she asked, worried about his ribs. Rook groaned as he pulled the heavy leather back on, wincing as he zipped it up. "I got a medic at the clubhouse. Stitch will patch me up. He's better than the docs at County anyway." Can I do anything?" Clara asked, feeling helpless. Rook looked at her, then at the gathered crowd. "Just tell him the truth," he said. "That's all." He threw a leg over his diner, the movement stiff and painful. He looked at the sheriff. "I'll come by the station tomorrow to sign the papers, Brody. I know where to find you, Rook." Brody nodded respectfully. "Ride safe." It was the first time a lawman in Lockhart had ever told him to ride safe. Rook hit the starter, the engine roaring to life, causing the crowd to step back, not in fear this time, but in reverence. As Rook rode slowly past the gathered locals, nobody laughed. Nobody looked away. Old Man Miller actually took off his hat and nodded. Rook didn't nod back. He just kept his eyes on the road. He wasn't doing it for their applause. He did it because he slept better at night, knowing he was a protector, not a predator. Clara watched his taillight fade into the darkness. Her car was still at the diner, so the sheriff offered her a ride. As she sat in the back of the cruiser, she wrapped her arms around herself, still feeling the phantom weight of the heavy leather jacket. It had felt warm. It had felt safe. When she got back to the diner to retrieve her car, the owner was there, locking up. He had heard the news. "Is it true?" he asked, eyes wide. "The biker saved you?" Clara looked at the empty stool where Rook had sat, where she had pushed his money back. "His name is Silas," Clara said firmly. "And yes, he saved me." She picked up the $5 bill that was still sitting on the counter, untouched since the afternoon. She put it in her pocket. It wasn't a tip anymore. It was a reminder. That night, lying in her bed, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept seeing the flash of the chain, the blood on Rook's knuckles, the sadness in his eyes when she rejected him. She realized that prejudice was a luxury of the safe. When the danger came, labels didn't matter. Only action mattered. She decided then that she wouldn't let it end like this. A thank you on the side of the road wasn't enough. She had publicly dishonored him. She needed to publicly honor him. She knew where the Iron Drifters clubhouse was, a sprawling compound on the edge of the county line that locals avoided like the plague. Most people would be terrified to go there, but Clara had seen the man behind the monster. She wasn't afraid anymore. She fell asleep planning her next move, the revelation of Rook's character settling in her heart like a warm stone. The next morning, the Iron Drifters compound was quiet. The gate was closed, guarded by a prospect named Jojo who looked bored. He straightened up when a beat-up Toyota sedan rolled up the dirt driveway. He expected cops or rivals, not a petite waitress carrying a white bakery box. Clara stepped out of the car. She had bandages on her wrists and a bruise on her cheek, but she walked with purpose. "I'm here to see Rook," she told the prospect. Jojo laughed. "Rook's resting. He took a beating yesterday. Nobody sees him." "Tell him it's the girl who owes him a life," Clara said, staring the prospect down. Jojo blinked, realizing who she was. The story of the rescue was already club legend. "Wait here," he mumbled, keying his radio. A few minutes later, the heavy steel gate rolled open. Clara drove in, parking next to a row of gleaming Harleys. She walked toward the main building, feeling the eyes of other bikers on her. But there were no catcalls, no intimidation. They looked at her with curiosity and a strange sort of respect. She was the one Rook had bled for. Rook was sitting on a bench on the porch, nursing a cup of coffee and smoking. His face was swollen, stitches visible above his eye, and he was moving stiffly. When he saw Clara, he tried to stand, but she waved him down. "Don't get up on my account," she smiled, walking up the steps. She placed the white box on the bench next to him. "I brought you that pecan pie," she said. "The whole thing, fresh out of the oven this morning." Rook looked at the pie, then at her. A slow, genuine smile cracked through his beard, reaching his eyes. It transformed his face, making the scars seem less jagged. "You came all the way out to the Devil's Playground just to deliver a pie," Rook teased, his voice rasping. "You got guts, Clara." "I came to apologize properly," Clara said, her voice serious, "and to say thank you. I was wrong about you." "I was wrong about all of this." She gestured to the compound. "You guys have a code, I see that now." Rook cut a slice of pie with a plastic knife she had brought. He took a bite and groaned in appreciation. "Damn, that's good." He looked at her. "We ain't saints, Clara, don't get it twisted. We do bad things sometimes, but we don't hurt innocents, and we don't turn our backs on women in trouble." "I know," Clara said. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the $5 bill. She placed it on the bench. "And I'm taking your money this time, but only if you promise to come back to the diner. Next coffee is on the house. Forever." Rook laughed, a deep, hearty sound that didn't hurt his ribs too much. "Careful. You invite me back. You invite the whole club. We eat a lot." "Let 'em come," Clara said, grinning. "We could use the business. And I think the town needs to learn the lesson I did." They sat on the porch for a while, watching the dust kick up in the yard. It was a quiet moment of understanding between two people from different worlds who had collided in the most violent way possible and come out the other side as friends. When Clara finally left, driving back toward Lockhart, she felt lighter. The town would talk. They always did. They would whisper that the waitress was hanging out with bikers. But Clara didn't care. She knew the truth. She knew that sometimes the knights in shining armor didn't ride white horses. They rode black Harleys, wore dirty leather, and had scars that told stories of survival. And sometimes the most dangerous-looking man in the room was the only one worth trusting. As for Rook, he finished his pie, watching the dust settle behind her car. He felt a little less alone in the world. He touched the patch on his chest, then looked at the empty road. He was an outlaw, yes, but for one woman he was an angel, and that was enough.